Hey, thank you, Jay. Appreciate it. Appreciate everyone that's with us this evening. Hope that you are having a good week. We do want to wish you a very Merry Christmas, and I hope that you have a great holiday season as you can. Uh, One or two asked about our daughter-in-law, called me and asked about our daughter-in-law and our new grandbaby and our son. Everybody's doing well. Kara stayed in the hospital for 48 hours. She was able to go home yesterday afternoon, and she had a couple of things. She had some issues that sometimes mothers have after having babies, and she also was diagnosed with COVID. And so Suzanne and I are staying away from folks for the most part, and so we gonna stay in for a while and social distance by all means, everyone. And so just keep us in your prayers. But we're feeling fine as of right now, no symptoms of any kind, and so our daughter-in-law is a very light case. Our son tested negative, and grandbaby's doing well. So thank you for asking, and maybe that gives you an update on that. But enough about me. We've been starting out on Wednesday nights with a little joke, a little maybe something to make us feel a little bit better and make us a little happier. And so let me share one with you that I know this woman passed away, and when she passed away, she met Peter at gate. And of course, now this is a made up story, but just bear with me. It has a funny ending. And so, in meeting Peter at the gate, she sees through the gate, she sees her parents, she sees a long banquet table. I mean, it's people just there. Oh, we've been waiting for you. And so she says, Peter, she says, man, this place looks great. She said, how do I get in? And he said, well, you've got to spell the word. And she said, well, okay. And he said, you got to spell the word love. And so she said, Love. And he said, well, you did really well. And he said, come on in. You can enter into the gates of heaven. And so 2-3 years passed, and one day Peter taps her on the shoulder and says, you need to watch the gate. And I've got some things I've got to do, and you need to watch the gate, and you're the keeper of the gate today. And so she's there, and lo and behold, her husband shows up at the gate. And she says, I didn't expect you here. And he said, well, I didn't expect you here. Anyway, she said, well, what has been going on? And he said, well, life's been pretty good. He says, after you died, he said, you remember that beautiful young girl, that young nurse that helped you while you were sick? And she said, yes. He said, well, I married her. He said, I won the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes. I won a lot of money. We sold that little house that you and I lived in, and we bought us a huge mansion and lived in that and enjoying that. We've traveled all over the world. We've had vacations to various places, and said we were just in Cancun just a while ago, and I've been out jet skiing and all these things, and I came in and took a shower, and I slept on the floor and hit my head, and he said, I'm here now. And he looked around and he said, boy, this place looks great. He said, how do you get in? And she says, well, you got to spell the word. And he said, okay, what is it? And she said, Czechoslovakia. Okay, well, you think about that one. I hope you're laughing. I can't hear you, but I can feel you laughing. God bless you. We're ready to study Mark chapter 11. We're going to begin in verse 12 this evening. Mark chapter 11, verse 12. Let me give you a little background, and I want you to know that part of our study is disjointed, and I'm going to explain why. If you were with us last week, you know that we began this 11th chapter of the book of Mark, and we began with Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem. And if you were with us last week, you recall we made a couple of statements. We are, at the beginning of Mark chapter 11, we are studying the last week of the life of Christ, as Mark gives us an account of those things. Now, there's a greater account if you combine Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's quite a few events, really, when you stop and think about it, that make up that last week. Jesus did a lot of things within the last few days of his life. But in Mark's account, and that's what we've been staying with, Mark starts right here at chapter 11. Well, Jesus was able to enter into Jerusalem. One of the things we know, especially from Matthew's account, is that last week of the life of Christ, Jesus during the day would come into Jerusalem, but at night he would go out to Bethany. and he would stay there for the night. Bethany's only a couple of miles journey from Jerusalem, and so it wasn't a big concern or a big thing as far as they were concerned with travel. But it is the back and forth that we see Jesus traveling during this last week. As we began, it says the next day. So from the day in which Jesus made his triumphant entry into Jerusalem, the next day, Jesus had come out from Bethany, and he was hungry. And seeing from afar a fig tree having leaves, he went to see if perhaps he would find something on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. In response, Jesus said to it, "Let no one eat fruit from you ever again." And his disciples heard it. This is a parable or a story, a miracle really, that has intrigued a lot of different folks. And later on, we'll make application and we'll show you the intent of what Jesus is trying to say. But just picture this event in your head. Okay, so Jesus has made that wonderful entry into Jerusalem. It's the next day, and Jesus comes upon a fig tree, and yet it has no figs on it. And we look on that, and you say, well, what's the key? Well, in Matthew's account of this event, Jesus comes upon this fig tree, and he sees no figs, and so there is a disappointment. And the disappointment is because in New Testament times, the fig on fig trees produce first, and then the leaves. Now, admittedly, in this time of year, in the springtime, Jesus would not have found ripened figs, but he would have found, if he comes upon a fig tree, he would see the promise of figs, and yet not, when he comes to this tree, he does not find any upon it. Why? Who knows? He sees the leaves, and I'm sure at a distance, Jesus spots the fig tree at a distance, and he thinks, okay, there will be something there to eat. It may not be ripened. It may not be sweet. It may not be as good, but I can find a little nourishment there. And when he gets there, there's nothing. Now, notice in Mark's account, he says, for it was not the season for figs. And some would say, well, see, therein, Jesus shouldn't have been disappointed because it wasn't time. Mark's account really lends us to the idea when he says it's not the season, just meaning these weren't ready. It wouldn't have been ready. They wouldn't have been ripened yet. And so Jesus, though, comes to this fig tree, should have had figs, did not have figs upon it. And so Jesus then, basically, as we would say, curses the tree. Nobody's going to eat any fruit of this tree then anymore. And one of the things that we know, and we'll see in just a minute when we get to it, is that the fig tree dies. This is the only miracle that Jesus performs that is judgmental. There are only two miracles that Jesus performs, really, that have negative end results. This one, and you might recall earlier on in Mark chapter 5, where Jesus cast the demons into the swine, and the swine jumped over the cliff and drowned in Gadara. These were the only two negative miracles. But this one that we're studying tonight is judgmental in nature, isn't it? Being judgmental in nature, Jesus could do this, but Jesus nevertheless places a curse upon the fig tree and it dies. Now, I want to make application for this a little later on because we're going to come back to it in our text. So let's just move to the next event, if you don't mind. So they came to Jerusalem. Remember, they're making this trip from Bethany to Jerusalem, which is just 2 or 3 miles. And so as Jesus and those that were with him came to Jerusalem, in Mark chapter 11, verse 15, Jesus went into the temple, and he began to drive out those who bought and sold in the temple and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. He would not allow anyone to carry wares through the temple. Then he taught, saying to them, "Is it not written, my house should be called a house of prayer for all nations? But you've made it a den of thieves." And the scribes and chief priests heard it and sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his teaching. When evening had come, he went out of the city. Okay, so on this day, the second day, if you will, first day he made the triumphal entry. The second day we have the cursing of the fig tree, and then we have Jesus cleansing the temple. This is the second cleansing of the temple. The first cleansing was found in John chapter 2. The second is found here. Mark talks about Jesus being in the temple and driving out those that bought and sold in the temple. Now, what was the temple? The temple was the place of worship. It was a place of prayer. The Jews, in many ways, saw it as a place of sacrifice, as opposed to Jesus just seeing it as a place of worship, a place of prayer. The Jews, by New Testament times, there had been those that had made their way, sadly, into the temple. Now, let's think about this for a minute. There were certain feasts that the Jews would go to Jerusalem and remember those feasts. And part of remembering those feasts and those events were to offer sacrifices to God. But a man or family that had made a pilgrimage of, say, several hundred miles could not bring a sacrifice with them. And so consequently, they were able, outside of the temple, to buy a sacrifice that would be acceptable. Now, imagine, if you will, for just a second. Say you're 100 miles away from Jerusalem. Now, we made the statement last week that in New Testament times, it was basically thought that a trip of 20 miles was a day's journey. So if you're 100 miles away, you're 5 days' journey. You're going to bring a sacrifice with you, and once you bring it all this way, you find out the sacrifice is not acceptable. I don't know about you, but I'd be pretty bummed out. So a lot of times these travelers, these pilgrims, if you will, these Jewish pilgrims, would come to Jerusalem with the idea of buying their sacrifice there. And so there were those that made money and off of the sale of sacrifices. There were others that exchanged money, because you remember, you couldn't bring Roman money into the Jewish temple and think that was an acceptable gift, an acceptable offering. You had to bring Jewish money. So consequently, there were money changers. They would change the money. They were exchangers, if you will. And so these folks, while they began outside the temple, through the years, they had made their way inside the temple. And this was not acceptable to Jesus. And so Jesus ran them out. And notice what he says in verse 17. Is it not written? And what Jesus does is quote two Old Testament prophecies, one out of Isaiah 56 and one out of Jeremiah 7. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it a den of thieves. Jesus said, look, this is a place of worship. This is a place of prayer. But you've made it a den of thieves. You've made it a hiding place for thieves. Now, it is said from historians that those that were the money changers and those that were selling the sacrifices were selling sacrifices at very high amounts of money. And the money changers were exchanging money at a very high rate. And so Jesus said, you've made it a place for thieves to be. And that's not what it is. This is a place of worship. Well, you can imagine the scribes and Pharisees, the Jewish leaders, if you will, of that day, they had already sought to kill Jesus. They had already sought to take his life. They wanted him gone. They wanted him dead. But now, it's true. They really want Jesus to be put to death. Why? Because he has gone against what they're doing. He's gone against their practices. He's made himself, by even running these folks out of the temple, he's made himself equal to the scribes and Pharisees, the priests of that day. He's made himself like them. And yet they considered him just a carpenter's son and not one of them. And so they thought he had acted indignantly. They thought that he had really overstepped his boundaries and overstepped who he was. And so they are grossly upset and sought the more to kill Jesus. You might say, well, what does this have to do? What story, what lesson can we learn from this? Jesus really is calling upon Jerusalem, calling upon the Jew to repent. That what they were doing, what they were practicing was not right. That it was time to change. And it was time to change from the old law and the old ways. It was time to change and to follow him. And they didn't like that. But that was the lesson being taught. Listen to me. Change. Follow me. And so they sought the more to kill him. The Jews really felt that they were the blessed people. And they had been blessed through the years. They boasted really of their holiness. And really made a pretense of the fact of, well, you know, we're God's chosen. We're the ones. We're it. But yet, in their rejection of Jesus, Jesus still gives them this opportunity. Let's change. Let's follow God. Let's follow his will. Don't make my Father's house a den of thieves. Make my Father's house a place of worship. Listen to what I'm saying. It reminds us that, yea, even in the church today, we need to be very careful. We need to be sure that we're practicing what God would have us to practice. That we do what God would have us to do. That we worship the way that God tells us to worship. That we make sure that Christ is the center and the focus of our life and our actions. That we make sure that we're listening to Jesus and following the teachings of the Lord. That is the call that God has made to us all. Well then, on the next morning, now remember that day, you had what? You had Jesus cursing the fig tree and you had the cleansing of the temple. So it's the next day. Verse 20 of Mark chapter 11. As they passed by, they saw the fig tree dried up from the roots. Now, think about it. This is not just they went by and a scorching wind scorched all the leaves and it scorched. This is a tree that's dead. Deader than dead, if you will. You know, sometimes in this part of the world, in the late summer, you can look at a tree and you can say, that's dead. But many years ago, I learned a lesson from a person. I had said something about a tree in my yard and how I thought maybe it needed to be cut down because it had died. And this lady said, never cut a tree in the fall unless you know that it's dead. And I thought, or you need to be getting rid of it. And I thought, well, okay. And so in the next spring, guess what? The tree came out. It was all right. But this tree in Mark chapter 11 was dead from the roots up. It is dead. Peter, verse 21, remembering, said to him, Rabbi, look. Peter thought back what happened yesterday, if you will. Jesus cursed the tree. Now Peter says, Rabbi, he refers to Jesus as master teacher. Look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered away. So Jesus answered and said to him, have faith in God. For assuredly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be removed and be cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that those things he says will be done, he will have whatever he says. Therefore I say to you, whatever things you ask when you pray, believe that you receive them, and you'll have them. Peter, the next day, as they come upon the tree, the fig tree, and now you got to remember that there were certain fig trees planted by the roadside. They lent themselves to that area of the world. But Peter says, look, Jesus, look, Rabbi, that fig tree, it is dead. Jesus then teaches a couple of lessons that are interesting. The first one is have faith. Have faith in God. One of the things that hopefully Peter learned, what Jesus was really trying to teach the Jew, was that there is more to faith than just a profession of faith. In other words, you can't just simply say, well, you know, I believe this, but you've got to have faith. Faith is not just a profession, but it's performance. You see, the tree professed to be a fig tree, but in performance, it was not. It did not produce any figs. Jesus is telling the Jew of his day, don't just profess to be a Jew. Don't just profess to be a follower of God. Follow him. And if you're following him, you know that I'm the one that's fulfilled prophecy. I'm the one that's the prophet that you've been looking for. I'm the one that is the Son of God. But they didn't have faith, did they? Faith's power is not in faith. Have you ever thought about that? In and of itself, faith has no power. But faith has access to the greatest power of all, that being God. You see, when we trust in God and have faith in God, we have access to the strength. Been thinking today, or actually yesterday, for whatever reason, it popped in my head that I'd like to do a sermon on Philippians 4, verse 13. I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me. And hopefully in the near future, we'll present that lesson. There's a supply of power that God has, and we, through faith, tap into that power so that he supplies us what we need. And so Jesus reminds Peter, you got to have faith. You got to trust, and you got to have faith. Notice what he says in verse 22. Have faith in God. But then he goes on, and he gives a spiritual side, a spiritual component, and he says that whoever says to this mountain, be removed, be cast in the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes those things be done. Now this verse has thrown some folks for a loop, hasn't it? In other words, there are folks that say, well, you know, all you got to do is say your prayers and believe God, and whatever you've asked, boy, it'll happen. Let us understand that just because we have faith in God, and then we pray to God for whatever it may be, that does not give us carte blanche to say, oh, well, we're going to get everything that we asked for and everything that we want because we have faith. Now, Jesus makes this statement. He says, you got to have faith enough to remove the mountain and tell it to be cast in the sea, and it'll do it. The mountains were around Jerusalem. They understood how mountains were constantly blocking and constantly in their way. And so what Jesus is saying, he's not saying, well, you know, say to this mountain, be removed, and it'll be removed. But what he is saying is don't doubt the nature and the power of God. He can do it. Whatever you're asking, God can do it. Whatever you need, God can take care of it. Whatever you're going through, God will help you through it. But you've got to have enough faith to trust in Him that He'll do it. Let me stop right here and make this side note for just a second. It is said that about 90% of all Christians at one time or another will have a faith crisis. Will have a time in their life in which everything seemingly goes against them. You know, it's sort of when the washing machine breaks down and your health breaks down and your job plays out. You know, everything happens at once. It's sort of like the commercial for Farm Bureau insurance right now that has played usually this time of year for several times, you know, where the lady says, so-and-so sick, so-and-so my husband lost his job, and little Susie broke her brand new glasses, and I don't have the money to pay for them. And the man leaves a $100 tip to help out the waitress. Well, things snowball and seem to snowball. There are times when those faith crises cause us to doubt. And we should be reminded of this text. Have faith in God, because God can do anything. God's power is great, and He can do whatever it is that needs to be done. And so, verse 24, therefore, I say to you, whatever things you ask when you pray, believe that you receive them and you'll have them. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, preacher. Oh, I like that idea, because that says no matter what I ask of God, God's going to give it to me. No. Sometimes you don't get what you ask for. Sometimes the reason being because of James 4, you don't ask. Verse 2. But then sometimes, according to James 4 and verse 3, you ask, but you don't ask in the right way, or you don't ask for the right reasons. There are times in which the Lord says no to our prayers. Paul can testify to that, can't he? 2 Corinthians 12, Paul said that he asked the Lord 3 times that his thorn in the flesh might be removed, and it was not. We need to remember that God sometimes says no, and that is His answer to our prayer. But what Jesus is trying to say here is that you have to remember that when you ask, you've got to believe. And in that belief, God will answer you. And then He says in verse 25, and 26, whenever you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, forgive him, that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses. So now all of a sudden, Jesus changes a little bit of the tone, if you will. Jesus had, by virtue of the fig tree, been telling Israel they need to repent. Now He's telling them they need to live their faith. They need to not just have a profession of faith, but a performance of faith. And He's talking about, all of a sudden, he gets off into this subject of prayer. He said, have faith. That faith will be, if you will be shown in your prayer life, but that faith must be active. And so He says, you want your prayer to mean something? You've got to forgive those people that are around you. I wonder, I don't have any way of knowing, but I wonder what went through the minds of the people of that day and age. Don't you imagine that there were those standing there that were thinking, that heard that, were thinking, yeah, He's wanting us to forgive Him, and telling us that our prayers to our God are not acceptable unless we forgive Him. That's all He's interested in, is our forgiveness. But He was trying also to teach the apostles, and in many ways, if you stop and think about it, He is preparing them. And you might say, well, how is He preparing them? He's preparing them to not be upset, vengeful, to hate, those that will crucify him. You've got to have a forgiving spirit. If you want to ask God for forgiveness, you have to have a forgiving spirit. I hope and I pray that you're listening and that you'll read verse 25 and 26 of Mark chapter 11 again. One of the things that in my 36 years of ministry, one of the things that I have found out is that people do not forgive others. They hold grudges, and they either hold that grudge or they retaliate against someone. And it may be as simple as when somebody says something against us, we try to say something back to them. To when they do something to us, then we try to get back at them physically. But the Bible teaches us to forgive. And in that forgiveness, he tells us that in that forgiveness, we can ask God for forgiveness. But if we are not willing to forgive, if we hold a grudge, God doesn't hear our prayers. And so, once again, Peter is left with this understanding. By virtue of the tree, by virtue of this lesson, don't just have faith in God. Don't just say, well, I believe. But make sure that you put that faith into action. Now, there's a thought for us. Our faith in God says, okay, I need to act. I need to do what God tells me to do. I need to listen to Him. And I need to follow His will. There may be times when I don't like what He's telling me to do. There may be things that He's telling me that I don't want to hear. There may be things, truths that He's asking of me that I realize I must do, but I don't want to do them. It's sort of like the story of the little boy that was at his grandfather's one day, and his grandfather was wanting to teach the young boy a lesson, and so he told the young boy, he said, son, you need to do this. And the little boy said, I don't want to do that. And he said, well, son, you still need to do this. And the little boy said, Granddaddy said, I don't want to do that. He said, whose rule is that I do that? And his grandfather said, well, that's God's rule. And the little boy said, oh, that makes a difference, Granddaddy. Yes, it does. When God speaks, we listen. When God says do, we do. Why? Because we trust in God, that God is God, and that in the end, God will save us. And so we listen, and we hear, and we follow. Next week, we'll pick up right there. This is a great place to end. We'll pick up right here, and we will study especially the question, as some question Jesus' authority, and we'll talk a little bit about authority there and how it resides in Jesus. You know, there's another lesson that I have been thinking about lately, and that is the idea of listening to Jesus. Why do we listen to Jesus? Then you could add, how do we listen to Jesus? And there's probably a Sunday morning sermon and a Sunday night sermon. We'll get to those, promise you. As we said at the very beginning, I want to wish you all a very, very Merry Christmas. Suzanne and I wish you a very Merry Christmas. I hope in some way that you're able to make contact with some of your family members this weekend. Love those folks. Love them dearly. Appreciate them for who they are. And let's hurry up and get this vaccine on the way so we can get back to normal and seeing our folks like we know, like we want to. May God bless you and keep you is my prayer. I hope you have a great week. See you Sunday.